It is June 25th. We are together again to talk about the mental obsession as openly as we can and allow the listener and each other the chance to discuss things that might not normally seem viable conversations, but actually help us reinforce the idea that telling stories about things that aren't happening has become sort of a mastery of humanity, while in fact, the idea of actually talking about what is happening, which is often not the things around us that are happening as much as the way we're thinking of them, that tends to affect us and also affect the actions we take in relation to those things that are happening. So if I'm thinking largely about things that aren't happening, I'm obviously not using my attention to pay to what is happening. So the chances are what is happening is not going to go as well as I think it might or could, because I'm simply not paying attention to it. And that isn't to say that we aren't capable of multitasking and having our attention going in all different directions, because all of our senses are constantly feeding us information about everything that's going on all the time. And so we're constantly in a relationship with that. And to miss that point is to make believe that somehow or another we're not present when that thinking we're doing is about something other than that sensation or those experiences that we're given that raw data from our senses. So if we're capable of attending to thoughts that aren't about things happening, we're not paying attention to what's happening as well as we possibly could. But it doesn't mean that's wrong. It doesn't mean we shouldn't or can't do that. It means we can do that. But to think of the thing we're doing is complicated as a result of the complications we create in thinking, and that our experience is difficult and life is difficult and the universe is complex because of the complexity and the impossibility of the thinking we're doing, is to miss the source of the problem rather than constantly tell the stories. It's to miss the source of the problem by constantly telling stories that are used to help justify that there's nothing else I can do about it, since it's just happening the way it's happening and it's always happening that way, rather than see that I have a chronic tendency of creating that experience and then disavowing my creation of it by making believe I have nothing to do with it.
Yeah.
So laughter would indicate some recognition of that. And it isn't always that funny. You know, one of the things I realized some years back is that if I think I am my thinking, I no longer think I can choose my thinking, because I now am in my thinking and I don't think I can see anything other than the thinking, because I'm now in it rather than observing it. And that's a choice in thinking, to make believe my thinking is reality and truth, rather than my thinking is just an imagination of what's going on. It's an image created in the likeness of what's happening, because I'm being given raw data about everything that's happening around me. I'm fed that data without opinion. My thought of that data is what I either struggle with or benefit from by adjusting what I'm doing in relation to the information I'm getting. If I smell smoke, there's a good chance there may be a fire. And if I don't tend to that and think about that, it would be a misutilization of the point of that sensation that I'm getting. So senses aren't bad. Sensations aren't bad. They're just things that are raw data that I can translate. And how well I translate them tends to lead to how well I survive and how well I thrive, how well I'm functioning within the realm of all the possibilities that I have to think of things correctly or incorrectly. And thinking tends to be a primary motivator to all actions, because no voluntary action occurs without a thought preceding it. If it's a knee-jerk reaction or something that has no thought involved, that's different than the kind of voluntary actions that we choose. So if there's no choice in it, which is very seldom, you know, it could be a spasm or just the same way that the knee jerks when the doctor hits the thing with that rubber mallet. It just reacts, knows to do that. That isn't a choice, but it's certainly a choice to be at the doctor to have him do it. So there's some involvement on my part rather than a complete disavowing of my involvement. Oh, there's always something I'm doing in relationship to what's happening, because if I didn't exist, none of it would be happening as a result of existing. Beginning to concede all that's happening is a part of what's happening for me, and I am influencing it all by what I'm doing because I'm interacting with it and it's having an impact on everything. is starting to see things in the absolute sense rather than the specific microcosmic self-centered sense. And the self we think is centered isn't centered at all. It's just thought centered around thought. It isn't a self. We call it self. It isn't a self. It's just thinking of itself. And we do that. We create that image and that unlikeness that we seem to constantly be fighting with internally, the voices in our head. They're all reflecting an obsessive thought that we're maintaining. All those arguments. You can't have an argument unless there's at least two people, like you can't have a dialogue unless there's two people. So to imagine there's a self in our head that isn't who we are is to imagine there's somebody else living in us, which is a very frightening prospect because it's a little bit like getting a parasite in your brain and not knowing how to get rid of it, or an earwig in your ear canal, not knowing how to get it out. It can be very painful. And I would suggest that if we didn't know better, we would not struggle and suffer. We would not have anxiety. We would not have stress. We would not have depression. Those are all indications of a knowing nature that is making us aware of a problem by giving us a level of discomfort to recognize something we're doing that is discomforting, all starting in thought. We're being crushed by a car. That would be an actual occurrence that's happening. And we would typically know what to do, which is to try to get out from underneath it in every way we could. Wouldn't be a lot of thinking about it. So the crushing effects of thinking about things that aren't happening, that give us that impression that we're being crushed, that we're depressed, that we're under a lot of weight and stress and pressure, are all coming from the voluntary effort we have to freely choose what we think. If a real threat is occurring, we know what to do. These imagined threats that are created by our thinking has us imagine we don't have any idea what to do because we're trying to be irresponsible for doing it to begin with and saying we have nothing to do with it. It's happening too. My brain is attacking me. My thoughts are intrusive. My ego is opposed to me, fighting me. So none of that's true. They're all imagined to be that way to disavow my responsibility and my existence, effectively. It's an argument for suicide. It's an argument for non-existence. I don't have anything to do with anything. I didn't do it. Well, if I didn't do it, it wouldn't be happening. And if it's happening, I've got something to do with it. Doesn't mean my perception's correct. But if I have any perception at all, it means that I am interacting with what's going on, and I may be mistakenly thinking about it in ways that are giving me a sense of condemnation because the thinking I'm doing is condemned. It has no basis. It has no connection to reality. And as a result, it's only being maintained in my thought as though it's real and true. Because if I didn't think it was real and true, I'd simply let it go and say, that's enough. I'm not going to continue that. And many of the things that I have learned that I continue to do seem to be in the subconscious level where I don't think I'm doing them at all, but I'm witnessing the effects. So I must have some knowing nature to have the effects, because the effect is always based on a cause. And if the cause is going on and I think I'm not doing it, and I continue to maintain I'm not doing it because I think I'm not doing it, again, I'm turning my thinking into reality while I'm witnessing the effects, and the effects are always going to get worse if I'm unwilling to admit the responsibility I have for the cause. And I would say I'm always responsible for the cause. Always. Again, my existence confirms my presence. It confirms my belonging. It confirms my connection. It confirms my essence is part of whatever the essence of existence is, in all ways, not in some ways that I can only think of and need to understand, in every way that exists, which would be infinitely possible. So to begin to understand those things is to begin to actually reckon with what we call a spiritual nature, but I'm not sure, spirit and God have gotten kind of a bad name through history, and I don't know that they need to be used to reflect this. But if you think in terms of truth and reality as always being true and real, and we think of the infinite as always being infinite, then there are no exceptions to those things. So how we think about them doesn't change them, it changes how we think about them. So the impact of that thinking is what we tend to struggle with, not the infinite source, not reality, not whatever we call God, not whatever we think is true and real, or what is in fact true and real. It's what we think of it that we're struggling with. Doesn't mean we can't make those choices, because we certainly can, and certainly have, and certainly are, to the degree that they're being maintained. And the conflicts we're witnessing are good examples of that internal conflict in our thinking relative to how we think things are, rather than seeing that how we think they are is never how they are, because they are how they are regardless of what we think. We don't have to think about things that are real to be real. So there's some relief if you get that point. We can stop thinking about it all and have it all, because we already do. We're already part of it. We can't be away from it. We can't be isolated from it. It can't leave us, because it does not operate in space and time. It has no place to go. All those common thoughts are based in a brain's ability to reckon with this relative experience we're having. More or less, here and there, then and now, as though there's a then. There's always only a now. It's always present, always where we are, always where we're thinking, always where we're doing what we're doing, always. And everything else happens to simultaneously be happening everywhere that anything's happening, and everywhere anything that exists that isn't happening, because it's beyond a thing, doesn't represent a thing. So everything is limited to everything, and things that aren't things, whatever that essence might be, if it's infinite, it may just be a simple presence that isn't a thing, because it isn't a spatially dimensional object. It's not made of matter. It's made of a presence that's a supreme form of consciousness. So that's a little meander. That's a little meandering. Any thoughts from the gallery?
I was just thinking about our entitlement to all that there is just by our mere existence.
Yeah, it confirms it.
Yeah.
And while it may be a right, which I would expect if it's our nature and it's our heritage and it's our essence, it certainly wouldn't be right to make believe that all I think is all it is, if what I think is limited in any way. So my efforts on behalf of that crippled thinking would always cause someone else's right to freely reckon with and have the totality of that freedom. It would invade that and violate that. And that tends to be what people fight over. That sense of imposition, that sense of violation. It's literally a spiritual rape of sorts. Mm-hmm. Taking what doesn't belong in the name of thinking the thoughts are reality. And I now need to demand everyone think like I do. And anyone who doesn't think like I do, even if I don't mention how I think, all of a sudden becomes a major threat to my life. Because I think my life is based in thought, rather than see thought as a vehicle to help me interact with the environment I am in and to survive and thrive, rather than become so contemptful. The only thing I can think of is how to hate people better and keep away from them, or limit my exposure, when in fact I'm always exposed fully.
Or even to think there's a them and an us, when there's just
exactly
us, or just one.
Yeah, and we can do it conceptually by conceding that they are part of what we are part of. Yeah. And that we all have the right. We're having a human experience, whether that is reality or not, who knows? Maybe there's a lot of contention that it's just an illusion, that it's just a conscious creation.
Well, the perception is for sure a conscious creation. The individual perception.
Yeah, well, that would be a brain
thing.
Awareness, yeah. A brain thing. So this effectively challenges everything that has been thought since the beginning of modern history, as far as I can tell, because if this has been going on to justify war and justify fighting, our country, has a war on poverty, a war on drugs, all kinds of wars are being fought. And they don't ever seem to be won, any more than the wars I have in my own thinking ever seem to win out. So to relate to things is to relate to things as they are rather than as I think they are. Because if I think they're only what I think, I am not relating to those things at all. I am relating to my thinking as being the actual creator of those things and the cause of those things. And I'm giving those things no credit whatsoever to have any nature whatsoever, rather than see that if they are the same nature, they're just something doing something different than I'm doing within the same realm of that infinite nature. To dismiss them out of hand as though they don't exist would be presumptive on my part, because to even exist them, to even dismiss them, suggests I'm aware that there's something to dismiss. So if this challenges that, and we talked, Gabe and LA and I took a walk earlier this morning, and we're talking about this. If we're challenging the basic precept of this thinking as being something that is self-imposed and self-induced, we're really standing in the face of the reactive nature and the impulsive nature and the compulsive nature of addiction and disease, and the tendency of anyone maintaining that to want to react aggressively to anything that challenges that. And that might seem like a huge thing to ever do and accomplish. And it would only be that if, in fact, what we were doing was wrong, relative then to starting to see that what everyone already knows is right, and that the fight they've been waging has been to maintain their own independent ideas of what that rightness is, which has never been right. So it becomes easy to imagine everybody actually coming to terms with this, because it's happened through history. When people realized that the horizon was not the end of the world, they started sailing in that direction and realizing that the world had always been there in the rest of it. The rest of the world that was unseen was always there. But what wasn't there was our adventurous, explorative, awe-inspired search of those new areas, simply because we had a thought that our limited thought, its horizon, was in fact the same horizon that was out there, and meant doom if I go beyond it. And I would say limited thoughts that are defended are thoughts that are thought to be true and real. And that would be a major clash with all reality and truth on a daily basis, 24 hours a day, to live that way. It would be present traumatic stress that cannot be overcome as long as that line of thinking is maintained. And to any degree we do it, we're all doing it. We're all participating in it. We're all contributing to it.
Well, yeah, it's just part of the human condition. It would be hard not to have any opinions on anything ever. I just think it's astounding that people state their opinion, try and cornhole you into it, and then at the end they're like, see, I told you. And the truth is, what's in my head is still in my head. It doesn't mean because I've conceded to let you feel as if your opinion is correct. There's a whole weird thing about people feeling like they won. And I just don't think there's any right or wrong. I don't have any opinions.
Well, I would say that's an opinion.
Mm-hmm.
And opinions by nature, the definition of a belief or judgment that rests on grounds insufficient to produce complete certainty. A personal view, attitude, or appraisal. That appraisal, that assessment, is what our thinking is always doing. It's gauging, it's analyzing, it's comparing, it's contrasting. It's doing what it can to address what's happening in ways that are useful and helpful and promote survival and promote a thriving nature, an abundant nature. Because that's the nature of abundance. That's the nature of an infinite source, is abundance. It's infinitely abundant. And opinions by their nature, when they're just opinions, are conceded as being an opinion. It's a belief. JP talks about that. The belief systems we seem to make believe are systems undermine our bodily systems to the degree that those belief systems are wrong. because they cause stress. They cause a dysfunctional relationship to reality and truth, to how the way works, to the natural order in our universe and in the world immediately around us, in the environment that we're in. And belief systems are often held to be true as cultural ideals. Which seem to be hard to break, but they're no harder to break than they are. It's harder to maintain the reinforcement of those things because that reinforcement needs to be done constantly. While we even think we're not even thinking about it, there's some thinking and attention being paid to it to continue to maintain it if it has no other basis than what we think. Obsessive thoughts are obsessive because they're trying to mimic reality and truth by maintaining a sense of permanence about something. And the only reason they would have to do that is because the thing they're trying to maintain the permanence of is not true. Because it has no other life than the life form we give it in the thought life we have of it. So it's just in our brains. And it's chosen. I choose those things. I have no obligation to maintain any of them. So there's obviously some commitment I have to thinking it's giving me security, that it's giving me hope, that it's giving me faith, or that I need faith and hope and security. It's going to provide security and I have faith and hope in that security. Well, in fact, the thing I have faith and hope in has no faith and is hopeless. And that's the doubt. That's the uncertainty. That's the underlying sense of constantly need to move like a shark, constantly need to stay in motion, to stay away from, to constantly evade, to avoid, to defend, to be protected. All that kind of stuff is coming out of that line of thinking, and it becomes generalized because if we think it's reality and truth, we think it is part of everything and everyone we see, everything and everywhere we go. When it's just a thought. It's literally just a thought, thinking about a thought that we've decided because it can come to a conclusion, because we can use thoughts to conclude something. We've concluded that if we think they're right, that's it. They're right, they're true, they're real. End of story. And we talked earlier today about this fixation being broken. Nothing needs a fixation that isn't broken. Why are we fixated on it? Because we constantly have to pay attention to make believe that if we don't pay attention, the death of this thing's going to occur, while in fact, there was never any life in that thing other than the ideas we had about it, which is effectively what ego is, an idea of a thing that has a life of its own, because we think that those self-centered thoughts, we think that those thought-centered thoughts are the self that we are. When we think that thinking becomes real and true, we think who we are is only what we think. And this is historically, I mean, it's the one of the base roots of psychology, that there's an ego to deal with. We need to deal with this ego. Well, we're giving it a sense of life by thinking there's something to deal with. If there's nothing there, wouldn't the natural state of our knowing nature be more obvious to us if we weren't preoccupied with a self that we thought was there, that wasn't there, that we need to straighten out with more and more thinking? And I'm not faulting psychology. Everything, apparently, within the human experience is an evolutionary process. People learn. We come to terms with things. But the terms always include pain and frustration and anxiety and stress because we're aware that something's wrong with what we're doing, and all those things aren't proof of reality, they're proof of something being wrong. Anxiety, stress, conflict, inner turmoil, emotional turmoil. Those are all indications that we have an awareness that something's wrong, and our body is disturbed to say to us, you're doing what you're thinking is disturbing. Not who you are is disturbing, because we're not who we think we are. We have an essence that knows, that seems to be struggling to express itself, but it isn't. We're just imposing a preoccupation on our thinking to the point where we think we can't express that thing because we doubt whether it's even there anymore because of our complete engulfed intoxication with this consuming thought. And a lot of it is beneath the surface. A lot of the stuff we can remedy in our head pretty quickly and feel better about, but there seems to be this lurking motivation that catches us off guard, suggesting that we think being on guard is our natural state, meaning we've got to constantly be protecting something. So the question's also in the announcement about, how would we be if we conceded there was an infinite source? How would we think then if we just came to terms as quickly as we seem to come to terms with the fact that our thinking is reality and truth? What if we came to the terms that reality and truth are reality and truth, whatever that means and whatever they are, without any further definition? What would happen to our thinking? What would happen to our experience? This is a question.
It would, for me, it was a fundamental shift.
Go a little further.
Like we were talking about this morning, once that switch was flipped and the logic followed, though there have been, some attempts to slip and ego and all of that, it's fundamentally changed my experience, my life. So, that's my experience. And we were talking about others in the group who are on a longer path of change versus an instantaneous path, and how those differences, how do we speak about those differences, and is the problem the same if our reaction to the solution is different?
Well, my suspicion is, and this easily could be wrong, that we each think uniquely to our thinking. And if, like I said this morning, if somebody was said to ask to draw a boat and everybody was given a same piece of paper and a pen, all those boats would look differently because we would all interpret it differently. And the fact that we can interpret it distinctly suggests that we each have the freedom to do what we want. And if that freedom is free, it would mean that we certainly aren't doing what everybody else is doing. And yet the premise of what we're doing, if it's based on the same problem, is simply being dealt with in different ways. And we can use those different ways to make believe that that means we're separate and apart and alone and can be, or just simply see that we have the freedom to think of things the way we want. And when that freedom, what became clear to me is that when that freedom was condemning me, it wasn't life and God and spirituality and some absolute source that was condemning me. It was the thinking I was doing about those things that was condemned because it has no basis. And I'm feeling it in my experience. I'm feeling that I have no basis in that because I know that there's no way I can apply it. The only thing I can do is think more about it and think more about it and think more about it and think someday I'll be able to utilize it if I do it longer and harder. That's exactly what I did with drinking and cocaine and drugs. I tried to prove I was in control by doing more of those things rather than say, here, I have a beer and that's enough. It was never the beer I was drinking that I wanted. It was the next one. And when there was any risk to that succession, that line of succession, I was busy trying to figure out how to solve the future problem rather than simply be satisfied with the present. There was no satisfaction in it any more than there is in the thinking that I imagine I can straighten things out when the thing I'm using that's thought about has no other basis than my own thinking. So it's independent in one way, and yet it's collective because it's impacting everybody. If I'm stressed, everybody gets a sense of that stress. It may not be as apparent to somebody next to me, to someone 100 miles away, but there is an impact collectively. Talking about it helps to begin to reorient the conversation to focus on things that are stable and actual and realize those things rather than continue to reinforce the stories we tell that basically create the conflicts that we constantly think we don't want while we're busy maintaining them and maintaining them and maintaining them on a momentary basis, not even on a daily basis, on a momentary, immediate basis right now. It's only the thought we're having now that's giving us those impressions, nothing else. If I maintain the same thought, I'm going to maintain the same impression. If I think it's the impression I have to get away from, and I don't want to admit that I'm causing the thought, I'm going to think stopping the effects is the goal. That's how addiction is perpetuated. Rather than recognize if I'm causing it, I don't even have to know why I'm causing it to simply concede if I'm causing it. I have no obligation, because I'm free to think whatever I want, to continue. None. I only think that when I'm trying to stop the effect and have it all backward again. And that backward reversal of thinking is inherent to lying, because a lie is only a lie as long as it's thought to be the one thing it can never be, which is the opposite of what it is, which is truth. And in an absolute sense, truth and reality, the opposite of truth and reality in an absolute infinite sense, are truth and reality. There is no opposite in that. So their opposite would be exactly what they are. It would reinforce what they are to even think of them in opposite terms, because there is no alternative to something that's absolute and infinite. And this may be a bit of a quandary to think about, but we don't have to think about it for it to exist. It already exists. It's the nature of existence. If it's the nature of existence that it already exists, it doesn't require our thinking. So the if part there points to everyone's chance and opportunity to reckon with the decisions they make and the choices they make and the responsibility that we each have for those decisions and choices. And if we're feeling the consequences that are conflicted, we're creating that conflict. It's not life doing it. Life isn't conflicted. It knows exactly what it's doing, and it doesn't have any doubt, because it's not in question, like anything infinite. There's no exceptions to it. So when you talk, Gabe, about that experience of turning the switch and seeing the stability immediately, and I think you said earlier today that it had never occurred to you that maybe your thoughts weren't real.
No, and that was the simplicity of your logic for me in the beginning that made, perfect sense, which nobody had ever said to me. So I think it's, I don't know what the word is, but amazing that you could go through 40 years, 50 years of thinking your thoughts are true, that you're the creator of reality and truth.
Well, in that alignment also, would you say that alignment indicates a knowing nature that was always knowing? You just hadn't thought of it.
Yeah. Yeah, but it's only when you think of it, do you sort of zap yourself, right into where you've always been? Does that make sense?
Well, I'm not sure it's necessary, but we've become so dependent on thought to think it isn't natural, and to think that it's natural for thought not to be natural, and to think that it's normal for thought to be abnormal, that we then are finally able to utilize thought in a direction that aligns with what's actually happening and real and known to us. And then think the only chance we have is to have that, which in fact, I suspect intuitive knowledge, you have probably had thoughts subsequent to that started to be laughable in the face of a sense of knowing that grew naturally, that you didn't need to be told anymore, because you're thinking on the basis of something now that's actual and realizable, meaning that it's applicable. So as you apply it and function, other things that might have seemed impossible to understand because you hadn't been told, all of a sudden become obvious. And I would suspect you've had those experiences in the last year.
Oh, in the last days.
Yes. Good. Okay. I'm trying to increase the potential to add some credence to the point. But yes, so that awareness ultimately doesn't come necessarily from another voice, but yet we offer each other incredible perspective to see the things we may not think we have, to see the things we may not think we think, and to have the things we all share becoming part of that conversation begins to reinforce the nature of an absolute, unobstructable, immutable, indivisible nature that is in fact nature. The human nature is not nature. It's what humans have developed as a natural excuse to justify the deficiencies that we tend to to have. And most times when people are saying human nature, they're not talking about the most elevated potential of humans. They're justifying this more decrepit kind of thinking that we do. And I may be wrong there, but it seems to me that's pretty consistent. I don't think people say it's only human nature to be healed, to know what we don't think we know and all that kind of stuff. That doesn't tend to be part of the conversation. It's human nature to fight. It's human nature to defend. It's human nature to be reactive. Those things aren't natural. We've just succumbed to the point simply to avoid the actual inducement of those things and the imposition that we cause by acting on those thoughts that are incorrect in ways that we try to make them right by claiming it's just something humans do. Certainly it's something humans do. It is not our nature. Destruction is not our nature. Disintegration is our nature. When we fall apart, we die, we fall apart, but the elements of our bodies don't go anywhere. They just return to where they were before we had a body. And that other essence, which I expect is probably not a material essence, can never be a part because it's never been a part. There is no parts or pieces in it to be divisible over. It's an infinite source. We call it soul, we call it spirit, we call it all sorts of things. What I can be assured of is that it is what it is, regardless of what I think. And when I start conceding that, my ability to reckon with that intuitive awareness begins to reassure my present state, because the present nature of that present state becomes more obvious, just like you described. As soon as you thought of it correctly, all of a sudden it was like, oh, boom, done. That's happening. So it's illuminating because it's bringing light where we thought we were causing darkness.
Yeah, I think, like I said this morning, one of the biggest components is to say, if someone's listening in, just to consider, like you said, just to consider it.
Yeah.
And I never even really considered it. So that's a helpful word for anyone listening, is to just consider these concepts.
Another point you probably remember too, Gabe, in the big book, Bill says, if we just think it's possible, rather than shut the door on it completely, that's all we need to begin with. Because if you think something's possible compared to not being, if you think it's not possible, you're never going to apply anything in that direction because you've already decided it's not possible. Why work? Why do it? Why put the boat in the water if it's going to sink? But if we think it's possible, and it is in fact possible, we'll be confirmed by the possibility of reckoning with it, because we'll begin applying it immediately. When you're dealing in thought as the source of our experience, which it largely is, aside from the circumstances and the environment and all the things we're interacting with that are causing those thinking, the thinking is still primary to what we think about those things. We start noticing that doesn't mean we can't think wrong and we can't act wrong, and all it just becomes things we're doing rather than things we are. They're not intractable. They're not impossible. If we're doing it wrong, certainly they're possible. If we can not do them wrong, we'll be doing them right very quickly and begin to actually reorder rather than disorder our functional capacity. It's just normal. Talking about it, in my experience, because of that point you make, gives me a chance to see with perspective what I might otherwise think I'm blind to. Because when I think I'm thinking, I think I'm in the thought. I don't think I'm the observer of the thought. I don't think I can see the thought. So to not see the thought would be to think I'm not the cause of the thought. I have nothing to do with the thought. So here I am observing a thought I think I'm in, claiming I have no cause of it, while I'm actually observing it as something I'm claiming to not have anything to do with. Simultaneously. Now there's an ironic conflict, which is largely what irony is the inability to really doesn't seem to add up, and yet it adds up. Why doesn't it add up? Because my thinking's twisted to begin with. Of course, it's not going to add up if it's my thinking's twisted. It's going to seem ironic when in fact it makes absolutely perfect sense. As you said, perfect sense. Think of that. Sense is perfect. Sense doesn't have an opinion. It's just feeding us data, raw data about what's happening. What we think about it is where the imperfection starts, when we think of it not as it is, but how we think of it. You can't think of it correctly when you limit what something may be to what we think, because all we think about is basically what's superficial, what it appears to be, not the substance of it, because we're not conceding our own substantive nature. That is not about appearance at all. It isn't about how things seem. It's about how things are in every respect right now. Absolutely, not doubtfully. Shadows of doubt are cast by the thoughts we have that we think can obstruct the light that we naturally have. And it isn't true and it isn't real, but we think it is so that we can support the contention that we should continue doing it. Because as creators of reality, if we stop, all reality is going to go to hell. While in fact, we feel like we're in hell while we're living that reality. So it's very interesting that we have like God in heaven. God isn't present. God's in heaven somewhere else we need to get to, but we never seem to be able to get there. We can go to the moon, we can go to Mars, we can go to these places, but we do not seem to arrive at heaven. They're all spatially, we've humanized God and dispirited humans by giving God all these traits that are human traits: contempt, fear, hatefulness, vengefulness. God needs to forgive us or we're going to hell. Wow, that's a very loving God. Sounds to me like ego. Sounds to me like the same hateful, spiteful creature we create and imagine as who we are when we think who we are is what we think. And it wouldn't be hateful and spiteful if, in fact, our thinking was who we are. We would love it because we would be fulfilling our complete capacity to express ourselves in the most full way. I don't know that most full is proper grammar, but so the laughable aspect of this, consider, how you hear a lot of people say, don't take yourself so seriously. It's a pretty good suggestion that the self we're taking isn't serious at all because it has no basis other than our taking it seriously. And that thing we even think has a basis is really only the thought we have right now and the image we maintain about it that we take seriously. It's the thought we're having right now about it that is causing that maintenance of it to continue. To any degree we resist that thought as being something we're doing, we're resisting, which creates a persistence. We're opposing it, so it creates a persistence naturally. So to do the thing that continues the thing and think we have nothing to do with it is really a good definition of addiction. Creates this cycle that seems impossible to stop because we want to keep riding it. Morning, Douglas. Good to see you.
Thanks. Good morning. Good morning, everyone.
So how do we apply this in a group as a conversation? I know that can be a struggle because it's a transition from what we normally do, which is to kind of tell stories about what we used to do and we don't do it anymore, so we think we're not doing it because we're doing it less and we're doing it differently, so we think certainly it's not happening anymore, rather than actually talk about where we are in the present, about these things that we can do and probably do and don't need to suffer and struggle from. Because if we're admitting what we're doing for what we're doing, if they're just thoughts that are colliding with thoughts, that's not a big deal to talk about any more than it would be a big deal to say that I ran into somebody with a shopping cart in the store. It happens. Thoughts can collide with thoughts pretty regularly. When they're thought of as thoughts and not reality and truth, there's not a lot of investment in that. There's certainly no life at risk over the thought, none. So to talk about it in those terms is to begin to recognize how laughable it is that we take this thing so seriously that is literally an imposter acting as though it's who we are because we continue to induce that idea that our thoughts are reality and all we are then is what we think because we're the creators of reality. Wouldn't that be a good definition for ego? Grandiosity, pompous, excessive. All of a sudden we become the creators of everything simply because we make believe that the thinking about the thinking we do is real. That's just a decision. It's a conclusion. It isn't reality. We can think it is, clearly. But think of the impact. And the other question is, what's the impact when we start actually considering that there's an absolute nature that's absolute regardless of what we think? Even now, by the way, since now is the only point at which we are ever experiencing anything. What if that was the case and we started talking in those terms? What would the conversation include? We know what the conversation includes when we talk about the things we do that are in conflict and the ideas we have that we think we're bound to and we think identify us. We know all that. We've done that 1,000 times or more. What does the conversation become when we start talking about it in these absolute terms? What's the potential? How do we realize that potential? The potential is something that's just not been realized. Doesn't mean it's impossible. It means that we haven't realized it. If I'm committed to thinking wrong, the impossibility is maintaining that commitment. Eventually, I have to fail at trying to maintain something that can't be maintained, that's impossible. That's why I'm afraid. That's the anxiety, the stress, self-centered fear. I'm going to be found out someday. What am I going to be found out for? Being a liar about who I thought I was. Never fulfilling my potential. Never actually realizing and expressing that absolute nature, while in fact, I've always been doing it while I've been busy obstructing it in my thoughts and my actions as a result. I've always been in the present. If it's present, if it's infinite, I can't be anywhere else. But I can think I am because I get married to those thoughts. And to the degree I think those things are actually obstructing reality and truth, I'm married to a thought that it's real and true. And it's a bad marriage, I will mention. And it's only a concept. It's literally only happening in our thinking. It's just an illusion that once thought real is delusional. So there's nothing there that has to even be let go of, other than the immediacy of my maintenance of that thought in the present that's creating that impression. I don't have to let go of it at all, but I can let go of the ideas I have that give me the impression there's nothing else I can do but continue to do it. I can start noticing that all those things are coming out of desperation, this twisted thinking. It isn't because it's the only thing I can do. It's because I'm justifying continuing because I've never bothered to do anything else. And it would defeat and basically undermine most of my life and everything I thought I stood for to begin to actually make that concession in full. Wow. Thoughts? Question?
Not only is my thinking torturing me this way, or not am I allowing my thinking to present itself as reality while I'm sitting here sober and not altered in an altered state. But what about like the guy on mushrooms at the music concert who decides the world is ending and he has to get a gun and shoot a couple people, It's like just feeding that wherever those thoughts came from, whether they were induced by chemically or were a combination of previous thinking enhanced by chemicals. Then the moment comes where it's propelled and executed in reality on other people. And then comes later that moment where there is no more chemical. There's only the hangover, the thought hangover. And ultimately then, in the case of that fellow, he's brought back to a reality of handcuffs and the backseat of a police car. probably desperately trying to convince himself that that's not reality. And now the rest of us wonder, what happened? How did the thinking, how does that thinking project out into what appears to be reality, the real world? And then how does that person then, how can we give them a pass by saying they had temporary insanity or momentary, discontrol of their thinking? And do we do that out of an awareness that we all do that we all lose control of our thinking from time to time? Or
I wouldn't say we ever lose control of it. We just give ourselves that impression to justify it has
Right.
a life of its own.
right,
And, I think that's the sort of fool, I don't think it was Shakespeare that said fools rush in where angels fear to tread. There was a poet that preceded Shakespeare that said that. But I think the point was that foolish thoughts rush in where angels fear to tread, and angels don't tread where there's lies
right,
because they don't tread in false realities. That's the point of being an angel. Now, I don't know that angels exist, but let's just take for granted that the metaphor of what they represented was this purity, this whiteness, this salvation, this present support, and the coming to the rescue, But I think part of your question that I think is worth noting is how many drugs are being consumed in the name of trying to escape what is considered to be a mundane existence without them. Think of the effort that's going into this. We've got an international epidemic that's now at a point where it's so obvious. I read an article today about Paraguay, or one of the major cities down in South America, that's just being overrun by people who are on crack. And they're in the neighborhoods where all the coke is being produced, so it's cheap. And they convert it quickly. And they look exactly like the people on our streets in LA, wrapped in blankets, dirty, clearly on benders. And what do we talk about it as? What they really need is apartments. That's their problem. What they need is an apartment. They don't need to be productive. They don't need to account for what they're doing. They need to be taken care of. We've basically discounted their dignity in the name of making believe that this greater thought process, which I would say is contaminated as theirs, is going to solve the problem. And it hasn't yet, and it won't. Because we're not talking about it openly. We're not thinking about it correctly. And to misdiagnose a disease is to treat it with things that help it get worse. And that's what's happening globally. We're not talking about it openly. We have a huge drug and alcohol problem in our country. And we only talk about it in relation to suicides or overdoses. That seems to be the predominant. How do we stop the overdoses? We're actually coming up with drugs to help people stop the overdoses. Not talking about why is it that everybody's going this direction? What's so incredible about that direction? Our chemical capacity in our own body, you talk about not being induced by exterior chemicals. Our chemical capacity by our own body is greater than any pharmacological.
yeah,
Big pharma is capable of producing in the brains of humans. It's so intimately able to develop things that I suspect we've never even come to witness, that would heal things quickly and immediately if our metabolic systems weren't depressed and undermined, and if our nervous system wasn't on high alert all the time, using up our adrenaline and turning our bodies. JP can probably return to talk to this a little better, but I suspect it turns our bodies into these acidic cesspools where disease is natural. It's natural in those environments to be corrosive and undermine health. And it isn't always a miracle to heal when you stop doing the thing that's causing the disease. And it seems to be a miracle to us because we've taken for granted disease is natural, just like human nature is just this fighting, warring machine that we're just going to continue. It's not natural. What's natural with our bodies is that they're designed to be responsive to what's happening when they're not being undermined by what we're thinking and as a result, what we're doing. Food has been a major problem in our country because we've basically bastardized all the food that was natural, turned it into things that can live on a shelf for years and years and years and never decay, but don't have any real value as food. They might taste good, but they don't ultimately give the kind of nutrition. When you have to fortify food, you're clearly maintaining the idea that food has no value on its own. It's already fortified. It's already got everything. When you take everything away from it and have to add it back, that is not health. That is a sort of devolution of health and process and progress. It's actually going, and the roots of farming is changing dramatically because people are starting to eat better, starting to recognize that pesticides probably aren't good for us. I've been talking about that since the 60s, as far as I can remember. So that corrosive, I mean, we're witnessing it happen with others, but it's the exact same thing. If the point we made earlier in the discussion that Gabe and Laura Alice and I had on our walk, we can experience it differently because we can think about it differently. But if the problem is the same, then there is great hope in us reckoning with that problem. Because it isn't something that has to unravel all the different unique ideas we had about it. If we can look at it accurately and start thinking about it accurately, those thoughts will straighten out very quickly because we won't be maintaining the thoughts that we're trying desperately to figure out what the hell is going on. How do I come to terms with this? Because if you're trying to figure out insanity, it's insane to imagine you will. So part of this whole basis is starting to see that for us as a species to be thinking that our thinking is reality when it's actually something that we are uniquely able to use in ways that are innovative and creative and helpful and express the abundant nature of nature, rather than impede it and fight it and think that it's up to us to come to conclusions for the problems we're creating. At the same time, we can continue to create the problem and wonder why the solutions seem to be so hard to find, hard to come by. It's very simple. It's not complicated at all. When I think about it and then try to define it, it becomes complicated. Because the more words I use, the more contests I have with someone who might use another word, because they're seeing it from their experience and thinking of it only as their experience, rather than saying, what's the principle we're talking about? Let's look at it from a principled basis, rather than this subjective basis that seems to eliminate objectivity when I think it's all I am. And it's funny that we would think of everyone else as a threat to our thinking and not notice that even that unifies them as part of what we're doing. They're not separate. We're all part of the same thing. We're all interacting on that same way. If we can talk about it more openly, which I recognize seems to be a challenge, the awareness wakes up as quickly as Gabe mentioned that he saw what he saw when he simply thought, maybe my thoughts aren't true. Maybe, possibly. So the idea of consideration is literally an awakened meditation. To consider things, live with them. We don't ever have to conclude them. If they're real and true, we'll start noticing applicable purpose for them and utilizing them. And when we're more functional, we'll tend to do more of those functional things than sit around and develop more dysfunctional thoughts, thinking that somehow disease is going to solve itself and heal itself. That obsessive nature of the thinking about the thinking is literally claiming that if I get more cancer, it'll solve the problem. It's crazy. It's literally crazy. So trying to figure out insanity is of no use because you'd be insane to do it, and you'd become insane trying. So that's where the futility is. When you find the futility, it's kind of like having faith in things that have no faith, are faithless. What would that be? A lie. You can't have faith in a lie without expending an enormous amount of energy coming to believe that it's your lack of faith that's the problem, rather than your faith in a lie that's the problem. Because in fact, if you have faith in reality, you'll immediately start functioning differently and better. Because it's faithful. It's always what it is. It's never what it isn't. It's always what it is. It's always available. It does not pull itself away from us because it's offended that we haven't been taking advantage of it. That's a human issue. that sort of quid pro quo. Love for us is very often do what I say as I say, and if you do, then that means you love me. That sounds like a hostage. That sounds like somebody who's been taken into bondage and, do not, we're going to put leg irons on you and everything, but we want you to be quiet. Don't scream. Don't yell. Don't make any noise. It's not love. Love is the freedom we have to think what we want as we want. And we're proven to have that freedom to go so far as to make believe that all we are is what we think, so that we can be so contemptible as to think that we should kill other people and ourselves as the only answer to the solution. That's a loving potential. And what do people do? Say, how could God allow this? Well, God doesn't allow it. God gives us the freedom to do what we want. We allow it. We create it. We do it. It's a human endeavor. It's not one. It's given to us by having been given all possibility that we act those ways and don't notice that they're one way we can do it. They're simply not the only way. And typically speaking, addiction appears to be the only thing we can do, the only option. So people say, I have no other choice, evading the fact that choice always allows not to be chosen. It's the whole point of choice. So to think we don't have any other choice and then use choice to justify it is to actually use the thing that actually disproves the claim we're making. And there's, again, the irony of the conflict that always comes out of maintaining lies. Just like the absolute nature is always revealed and becoming aligned with in our thinking. All we're aligning with is our thinking, not our soul, not our spirit, not our essence. But starting to align ourselves with reality in our thinking starts to allow our thinking to actually function on a basis it already knows, because it's known it the whole time while we've been asking it to do what it can't do. Trying to prove that we're ultimately in control and charge, because if we're the creators of reality, we might as well start proving it by making sure everybody else abides by our dictates. Probably dictating is the basis of dictators.
Mm-hmm.
So what's the world look like as we talk about that in ways that we become inclusive rather than exclusive? What happens?
We tend to allow ourselves and everyone else to be as creative and as informed or as uninformed, but as we allow everyone to be what they can become, and we allow it freely, and we
Even be what they are without having
be
to
what
become.
they are,
Without having to become. They already are.
That's right.
Yeah.
Be exactly who you are.
Exactly.
And we find that abundance, that there is always enough, because if you allow me to exist, and you allow me to exist in the way that human must, so I must eat and have water and air to breathe and everything else. So you would not deny me those things. You would not hoard them to yourself, because you know that everything is already set up clearly to allow us to be here. We already know that we throw away 40% of our fruits and vegetables before they even, as soon as they get to the market, they begin to sort them out. By the time a truckload of vegetables is from being picked to being sold, 40% of it's in the garbage. Our water, we think of water as something that we drink and shower with, but we also use it in the form of rivers to carry garbage and chemicals away from our city and our neighborhood. And we have sewer systems right now that are just dumping garbage and sewage into the ocean 24 hours a day. Garbage and sewage.
Yeah.
Can't stop it. It's happening in California. It's happening in every coastal city. No one can seem to stop it. We say, well, don't put chemicals down this storm drain, but yet that storm drain runs right into the sewer drain. So we're just crazy with this. We try to make things look like we're considerate and we're thoughtful. And then we hand it to the next person down the line. And then by the time it eventually gets to someone who isn't so thoughtful, someone who's thinking is, we could have the whole city thinking, yeah, this is great. Let's protect the environment. But he gets to one guy and he goes, hey, look, if we just do this, we save a bunch of, yeah, a couple of the guys go, yeah, I think that's a better idea. And it all goes away from us. Here in Mexico, they're having this big awakening in their politics. They had all these political parties fighting and trying to get candidates and everything. So 3 of the biggest political parties just got together and said, we'll pick the candidate all together and we'll put that person up. No one else will dare try to go against us. So we're going to get a candidate for president on the next go round. That's going to be someone that comes out of left field and is supported by all the major parties. We have more than 2 here with these major parties. So they're going to be the big alliance, and then there's going to be 1 or 2 other ones around that have been trying to get some traction. And that big alliance is there won't be anybody to talk about it. There won't be anybody to complain to. The thinking of those people and how they think everything should be run for everybody else is going to be likely whatever they decide. And the rest of us can think what we want to about it. But unless on a local level, we maybe try to resist. But so thought control is beginning right now. They're beginning the not the campaigns, but of the individual politicians, but they're beginning the campaign of getting people to come along with their thinking. That this is the best way to do things. See how democratic this is if we get together and we make a decision for you. And so now that the thinking of the people, you talk to the common person on the street, they have no idea, no control, no thoughts. They're just moving forward. Today, we got to go buy some tomatoes that are not organically grown. And, we got to go live our life, buy some potato chips and a Coke and hope that we don't die of diabetes next week. And the thought, the awareness of the mind control of the awareness that we're giving up our very greatest power as human beings to think and to decide and to make choices. We're just giving that up left and right all around me here. And I'm like, but you have choices. Let's all think for ourselves and see where that goes. Instead of allowing and going, well, I don't know how to handle all those things. What do I know about anything? So I'll just let somebody else tell me what to think. And that, I think, is another big sickness like drugs, where we just get so lazy about thinking, so inconsiderate of our own
It's
powers.
exhausting to continue to make believe that thinking is somehow going to be the solution to our problem. Because we've already been thinking, whatever we've been doing, we've each been choosing to do, to participate in, to have it happening. So we're all part of that issue. I would say the biggest oversight is that we think a lot about what everyone else is doing and seem to have this great clarity, and we miss the contributing factor of our own participation in that, and notice that it's what we're each doing that creates that collective, seemingly insane conclusion. But I didn't come to terms with my drug addiction and alcoholism until things were really bad. I created the bad to finally come to terms with it because I couldn't see it otherwise. I wouldn't see it otherwise. It wasn't that I couldn't, I wouldn't. And so if these pains are becoming obvious, it may be obvious that people are willing to start seeing what they're doing because we've basically exhausted our good ideas because pretty much everything has been polluted.
Uh-huh.
And literally, these things we're talking about on a global level are starting to threaten us sufficiently that maybe it does get our attention to notice that it's each of our participation. Each of us decides to get sober alone, for instance, and yet we stay sober together. We don't make that transition to unity until we make the concession of our own part in that dilemma. And to any degree, I see people out there doing things that I think are impossible to stop. I'm seeing them more as people who are thinking their thoughts are true and real, which is the disease, rather than seeing them as absolute beings with a nature that's infinitely connected to all things, and then see that they are suffering the same way I suffered and am suffering to any degree that I'm maintaining a thought about anyone or anything that is based only on what I think rather than what that thing or what that person is. And start to notice that that's I would say the spiritual awakening of the 12 step. Because what's the message in that? That we want to help. We want to serve. We're here to help and cooperate with each other. We're here to provide a solution, meaning we're not still gainfully part of the problem. And what is the next thing? Practice principles in all our affairs. That's a 24-hour-a-day thing. What's the practice? Because I'm not well practiced. I seem to apply my own thoughts and my own ideas as being principled that are unprincipled and immoral and unethical. And the practice is that these things do not change. The principles are ultimately white light and love, because all the different variations of all colors add up to white. And that's what visibility is. And the purity that the principles say in Alcoholics Anonymous and all the other 12-step programs came from was honesty, unselfishness, purity, and what was it? It was honesty, unselfishness, love, and purity. And I would say love is pure and honesty is pure. What we do with it by making it our own impurifies it, it pollutes it, it contaminates it. Thinking it's something different for me than it is for everyone else is seeing something that is unique to me as being true for everyone else. And the conflict isn't with everyone else. It's me seeing them thinking different than I'm thinking that's wrong. It's the wrong I'm thinking that is causing that. Nothing more than that. So this discussion, while you're pointing to it, Douglas, gives us a chance to notice that I have a lot of weak ideas that I take for granted are true, and they always present conflicts whenever I speak of them as though they're true. They always generate conflicts, and I'm always a little uncomfortable about them and a little demanding that they be heard and understood and seen, because I'm trying to reinforce that thing I call reality, which isn't real. It's the diseased nature of the thinking that it's real. And most of those things, in my experience, come up as circumstances change. When I feel overwhelmed by circumstance, I feel overwhelmed by what's happening in the world. It's revealing, it's giving me a chance to start to notice the things that I'm struggling with, because if I was at a perfectly comfortable state, I wouldn't bother to think of anything. It's actually the discomfort that helps me start to look at the things I'm doing that are discomforting. And yet when I align with something that is uncomfortable, like the guy who's decided to take peyote or mushrooms and have a great time at a concert and then ends up thinking the best thing I can do is kill people, it's no different than the guy who is not drinking and not using drugs, who comes to that same conclusion, thinking that that's his solution. The solution is I'm going to do something that basically leads to my death. It's basically an act of suicide, because it's going to take all the freedom and all the natural things away from him for the most part. And the chemical cocktail we create in our systems actually have us make believe those things are true, because it begins to feel true, because our body is responding to the thoughts we're having by creating this disturbing chemical cocktail of things that are hyper sensitive and hyper disturbing. We create the disturbance, the feeling, the weight, all that kind of stuff. It's not an accident. It's not a coincidence until coincidence is seen as the word. It's coinciding with what I'm thinking. It's immediate. And the other thing about these problems that seem, if we think we can dump sewage into the ocean forever, during the time we haven't reached forever, when the problem becomes so apparent that now we're all contaminated and have no ocean to pull fish from, it all seems like it's working.
Mm-hmm.
And it's kind of what I did when I was drinking. I thought, well, it's not as bad as it could be yet. So there's still hope. What do I do? Continue, rather than be proactive. That means I need to be reactive, and we need to get to a point where there's so much desperation that there is no other alternative. We're trying to justify the fact that we don't have any choice to be proactive and to be thoughtful and to be gainful in what we're doing. When I was a kid, my mother had us watch the Jacques Cousteau things. And in the 60s, he said there was no ocean in the world he'd been to that wasn't contaminated.
Mhm.
That is a hell of an effort on our part.
Mm.
It's a lot of work it takes to actually undermine nature, while that nature completely supports us and does everything it can to heal and remedy everything that we ever do negatively. It does its best to reckon with it.
Now scientists are saying that nowhere in the world does rain pure water coming from the heavens anymore.
Right.
It's all contaminated with microplastics and all this stuff and carbons and things that are harmful. So we're pointing out our failures, or pointing out our trajectory, may help us speed to some awareness. Having it pointed out to me, it didn't help me. Having my drinking and abusing trajectory pointed out to me didn't help me much. It was when it started to hurt me personally.
Yeah.
And when my hurting other people began to hurt me, some sort of little spark of conscience that exists in all of us. Mine was scarred over by years of not listening to it. But at some point, something.
Think of how that narrative helps you justify that it really was barely there, rather than you were barely listening.
I was barely listening, right?
Yeah.
Exactly.
So
I
no difference today.
I tried to silence it as much as I could with my thinking.
Right. And no difference today. It's the same methodology we use in the stories we tell, because even the scarring is an image we create attached to a narrative to give the impression. Scar is normally doesn't have nerves in it, so it doesn't hurt typically, but it's always contracting. Interesting that it's always pulling inward, always tightening, like a noose. But we create this imagery to justify that what we're thinking is in fact real, when in fact our awareness, our conscience is always fully aware. And it's insane to act as though we don't think it is. It's insane to act as though what's real isn't real. It's insane to act as though we can even deny it and make believe that denial and that defiance and that defense and delusion as a result could ever be real. That's insanity. And this has been going on so long that the evidence of it in the present moment, the cumulative evidence now, is becoming so obvious that it's being spoken about more openly. When I was a kid, they didn't talk about, there were companies that dumped 36-inch wide pipes of industrial pollution into the rivers in New York and throughout the country, just all day long. No thought whatsoever. Well, actually, there's thought. That's not true. There was always thought. It was just thought that if it didn't affect me immediately, it isn't a problem. And the fact is, it is an immediate problem for each of us to allow that thinking to exist and not think it's going to pollute and contaminate someone somewhere at some point. The contamination is immediate. And that's the thinking. My suspicion is this has gone on so long we think it's natural, but it is not. It is unnatural. It is abnormal. And the allergy that we're witnessing is to a lie. We're allergic to lying. Nature, if it's based on truth and reality, does not include lies. Only our thinking includes lies. Only our thinking can be obsessive. And we set that in motion by maintaining ideas that aren't true and thinking they are. just like we think our thoughts become reality and truth. We're capable of thinking that, and we are free to think that. It doesn't mean when we feel condemned that we've done the thing that's actually free. It means we've been free to actually create the condemnation that we're witnessing and experiencing. And to see that is to begin to realize we have no obligation to continue, none whatsoever. Only the sick thought thinks the only thing I can do is keep doing the thing I see as sick. So I get triggered. I notice things. Circumstances get a little beyond me, and all of a sudden I notice the weakness of my defensive attempt to overpower and control and dominate to fix the thing. And I've realized that fixation is basically always fixated on something broken. So the fixation on it is actually keeping it broken. I'm maintaining it as though it's real, when in fact something that's false doesn't exist except in my thinking. And to give it any sense that it has any sense is to give it a life that it does not have, and make believe I have to let go of it, rather than see all I've hung on to is the idea that there was even something to hang on to. And the immediacy of that helps to immediately notice, oh, if it isn't even there and I'm thinking it's there, that's insane. Right now, insanity on full bloom. I'm thinking, and not only that, I'm talking to myself about the thing. Now I'm hearing and seeing things that don't even exist, as though they do. And my sense is that we don't have a voice in our head. We have a voice for just about every collection of thoughts we've ever come up with. And that all those voices are attached to some idea that has no basis, that we keep talking to as though it does and thinking about as though it does. Simply because we keep thinking about it, we think it has a permanence, which is coming from the permanence of our perpetual thinking about it. And our reliance on thinking as being the solution, rather than the greater awareness of a knowing nature that we all absolutely share, that has never been at risk and never been diminished and never been polluted or can be contaminated at all. So this reversal of order has had us acting out of order. Of course, we're trying to oppose the natural order of things by thinking it's human nature, and what else can I do? After all, the worst thing is the only thing I can do. That's addiction. And you're describing it, Douglas, in your experience. That it wasn't until you started noticing in your thinking that it started to become obvious that it was what the thinking compels the action. The outer action, thinking is an action, first of all. It's actually an action. Why? Because it's happening. Actions happen. That's it. And if I'm paying attention to what isn't happening and thinking all that's happening isn't happening, I'm certainly not doing a very good job of paying attention to what I am doing that's happening. I'm losing myself in the concept that all there is to be consumed and intoxicated with these ideas I've created that aren't happening. So the creation of it seems lost on me because I'm dealing with the effects and not noticing I'm the cause. I don't want to see that I'm the cause. I want to only be the effects so I can maintain them. So I'm constantly trying to fix the effects by feeling better and getting over them. And what am I doing? Maintaining them as though they're real. When in fact, it's the cause of my thought continuing to think about it as though it's real that's causing the effect that I'm trying to get over. So here I am, the master and the slave, the thesis and the antithesis in the singularity of a thought, opposing itself, thinking I shouldn't be here. I don't belong here. I should be somewhere else with someone else and more or less of something else. Why? Because I'm not allowing what I have to have me in the essence that absolute loving ultimate nature already has. It's simply a concoction of thought. It's illusion, thought to be real, which is delusion. Nobody struggling in the desert to get to the oasis in the distance that was a mirage ever got cooled down or water from that arrival, ever. So to trust in things that are untrustworthy and to have faith in things that are faithless and to believe in things that are unbelievable because they have no basis, it gives us the impression that what we really need is more faith in God, when in fact it takes very little faith to begin to realize that if that power is there, it doesn't need our faith at all because it's been faithful to us the whole time. And it has been trustworthy the whole time. And it has been not full of hope because there was never any doubt. It wasn't ever in question. And it starts to turn the table. We don't have to think of that as God. We don't have to think about it in religious terms. We can, certainly. But to any degree that those cause contempt and isolation and distinction, we're not thinking about that thing we call God, because the infinite has no divisible means, has no divisible, immutable. It's immutable, inviolable, and indivisible. Can't be split up. It has us. I would say it is us. Not us as individual thinkers, but us as essence. Us as a present state of being, present state of knowing, present state of awareness that is complete and whole. It isn't part-time, sometime, maybe. It isn't spatially driven. The dimensions that humans have created, the first dimension is a point, the second dimension is 2 points, something like, I forget how it all goes. 3 dimensions, at least 3 points to give depth. All those things are human dimensions. Reality is part of all the dimensions. And some of those dimensions are non-dimensional. So for us to think of them in dimensions and continue to try to figure out what's infinite is to deny the infinite, because it has no dimension or spatial, it has no time or space. And we're looking at it from space and time, trying to figure it out. What's the dimension? It's the 14th dimension. It has no dimension. And yet the dimensions we rely on and talk about are all human-made, like the clocks are human-made. The date is human-made. If we actually had the right date, we'd be in year like 13,800 million something or another. 13 billion 800 million something or another. I don't know what the actual carbon dating of the history of the universe is, but I imagine there was probably no carbon at the beginning. The ultimate point is that the security we're seeking, we have. The assurance we're seeking, we have. The seeking we do is the claim we don't have the security and assurance. We set it in motion by making believe it's somewhere other than where we are and who we are as we are now. And we can think all we want. That fact will never change if there's an infinite spirit. And if there isn't, my question would be, what would be beyond what would be greater than the finite to maintain the limits? Finite is just a concept within an infinite realm. It's just a thought, like our thoughts are thoughts. They're not limited, but we can maintain them as thoughts. Doesn't mean that they're not part of an infinite structure. It simply means we're maintaining a thought. When the thought becomes reality and truth, now we've taken on a fight with reality and truth that can't be won. So surrendering in our parlance is basically conceding that things are actually what they are and not what I think. It's beginning to say that if the issue with alcohol was finally coming to terms with the fact that I had no power over the lie that I could control and drink it or control and enjoy it, and the other comment was the insane idea of every alcoholic is that someday they'll be able to drink like others, like sane people, see people that do it that aren't alcoholic, that can drink, they can have a drink or have a half a drink and leave the rest. They're not just pounding them down as though there's no end in sight. So that's all a thinking-based thing in the first step. My lack of power was power over the idea that I could control and drink it, and then I could do it the way I saw other people do it. In thinking, it's starting to see that I have no power over the thinking I do that's a lie, not because I ever had any power or should have power, but because there's no power in the lie. It's just imagined. And when I think of a lie, all I do to maintain it is to imagine it's true. That's what the basis of a lie is. It's imagining that it's exactly the opposite of what it actually is. So something that's actually imagined to be the exact opposite and only the exact opposite, what would the thing be? But nothing. It's claiming only to be what it isn't. We're actually making the claim that there's no lie in the universe, where again, the irony in the absolute becomes revealed. To look at it clearly is to say, oh, how could a lie is a lie isn't a lie, by the way. When you finally admit the lie is a lie, that's accurate. What happens? Disappears. There's no story attached anymore. There's no effort attached. There's no drama attached. There's no reactivity attached. There's no defense attached. None of it. Because it only existed in the preoccupation of our own thinking. It existed. It's the same with all these other things. So the inherent Surrender with alcohol is to admit to our innermost self that we can't control it. We have no power over it. The admission of thinking is to admit to our innermost self that there was nothing ever to control, that wasn't a lie. There's nothing there. Absolutely nothing. There is no ego. There is none of the things we concocted to justify that it was being done to us and happening to us and intrusive and against us exists in that, because it was all just thinking, fractured states of thinking, trying to create narratives around something that isn't even happening, other than the thinking we continue to do about it. When I try to fix my ego, I got to have an ego to fix to do that. That means it's got to exist. I've given it life in my own thinking, but it doesn't have any breath and it doesn't have any blood and has nothing more than appearance. And what is thinking masquerading as reality afraid of? Other thoughts. And what does it have us tend to do? Develop appearances, project appearances, constantly worry about how we look and what people think of us. Why? Because we know our thinking is full of shit. Literally.
I'm a spiritual seeker.
Yeah. Good luck. Spirituality has to be lost to be found, right? And to seek it is to say it isn't here. I've got to go find it. And what we're really trying to do, here again, the absolute revealing itself, we're trying to feel better about the thing we're doing that's worse. We're trying to come up with, why? Because I want credit for what's wrong becoming right. I want to prove that I can finally do it. And you know, it's ironic.
I fixed it.
I never gloat in what I do right. I just take credit for it immediately. But the wrong I do, I can never take credit for. I never want to admit having anything to do with, for the most part.
Until I fix it. Then
Interesting. Yeah, until I make it real.
Make it real and say I fixed it.
So anyway, that's the discussion. And
so what's wrong with being a spiritual seeker?
nothing, but it's claiming that it's missing. It's claiming spirituality must be somewhere other than where we are. It's claiming that an infinite source is not infinite and that it's somewhere else. It isn't to say we can't do those things and we can't improve our conscious contact, which is our thinking about it. We can improve it. But ultimately, it's to see that an infinite source isn't letting go of us. It doesn't have anything to let go of because it doesn't have any spatial dimensions to it. It isn't, if it's infinite, it's not functioning in space and time. Space and time is a concept within it. It isn't something that it can let go of. We can't be let go of any more than when our bodies disintegrate, our essence disappears. If there's an essential characteristic of soul or spirit, it would be revealed. And most of those things we talked about, those near-death experiences, if you listen to people's experience, they're pretty profoundly made aware of something that gives them a vital spiritual experience exactly as Carl Jung described. And my question is, why do we need to be near death to see that? And I would suggest because the problem hasn't gotten so bad that we're finally willing to admit that maybe we've been contaminating the earth long enough to continue would be ridiculous. Maybe we keep stretching to that point because we think everything's fine because it isn't as bad as it possibly can be, while we could become proactive in our thinking and begin to concede the fears and the anxieties and the stresses that we keep using to give ourselves the impression we need to get something else somewhere else, rather than begin to recognize that pure white existence, that pure white light, if it's pure and white, there are no shadows, there are no doubts. There is no uncertainty. There is no question in it because there is no solution in it because there's no question. There's no answer. So to seek them is to make believe they're not here and they're not here now. And it isn't, again, to say we can't do that, because I suspect we do that on a daily basis, because I've never had anyone come to me and say, I want to learn to feel worse and I want to learn to have more negative thoughts. And wouldn't that suggest that what we're doing consistently and chronically and thinking we're not doing is worse and negative? What is negative? It isn't. It's a negation of what's happening. It's the attempt to pretend what's happening isn't happening. That all that's happening is what I think is happening rather than what's actually happening. And if what's actually happening is reality and truth, I don't have to think about it at all. There's the surrender. That's the ultimate surrender, is to say, oh, I don't have to think of it at all. Now what am I? Free to think of anything I want. The chances are, since I'm not feeling condemned, I will not think of contemptful things to do. Just won't occur to me. What will occur to me is, what's the best I can do for everyone? What's the thing I can do to enjoy with everyone, to participate in it with everyone? What are those things? What would be the most beneficial? Now I'm dealing in the exploration of adventure and inspiration and awe, rather than this kind of dismal approach to how do I get through another day.
The spirit level of connection with the world and people exists already. I don't need to seek that
Yes.
spirit. What I
Right.
need to do is just make myself aware. I am available. I'm aware that I am a part of the spirit. The spirit permeates me and everything else. So all I need to do is act as the spirit. I am the spirit.
Well, as you begin to allow your thinking to concede what you know, you will naturally start acting in ways that reflect the knowledge rather than more and more thinking. So
Right.
that thinking,
So
here's the thing that's interesting. We've developed all these ideas about what we need to do and have to do, which isn't true. If the infinite has always been infinite, we've always been acting on the basis of the infinite. We've been preoccupied with an idea that the world is based on how we think and what we think, which has been insanity. So basically, humans have been insane the whole time, to the degree that they've made believe what the world is what we make of it, rather than seeing that the world was ready-made and nothing we ever make in the world is actually new. It's a transformation of matter that's always been here. All we're doing is taking stuff and saying, here's dirt, I'm going to turn it into a refined sense of clay, and I'm going to make a pot. I'm not really making the pot. I'm transforming the gift of reality and matter that's already been given me. Now, matter may not be any more than illusion either, because if it's within an infinite space and it seems separate and seems limited, it would have to be unlimited and infinite in its own essence. And yet we deal with it, and we eat, and we have needs, and we satisfy those needs through doing things that seem to be relative. We eat and we farm and so the question is, could we do those things better? And if we're thinking insanely, doing them wrong would add up, because it starts to convince ourselves that the insanity is in fact true. Because look at how bad everything's going. Look at the results. Everybody else is such an idiot. We get very good at figuring out what everybody else is doing that's wrong, and not noticing that we're actually the creators of that by making believe that everybody else is separate from us and doesn't have the same exact absolute basis. And they're simply suffering and struggling with the same thinking that you and I struggled with, to a degree that may be a little more obvious and a little more polluted. But that instantaneous awareness is as quick as we look at it and say, oh, if it's something I'm doing, I don't have any obligation to continue at all. The freedom comes in recognizing how things actually are. There is no contempt in that. There is no condemnation. Intuition, we intuitively know how to handle situations that used to baffle us. What baffled me is that I kept going to thinking. Let me think more about the thinking I'm doing that's causing the problem and see if it doesn't get better. And the harder I think and the more I do it, the worse I feel, and don't notice the feelings telling me what I'm doing is wrong. It isn't me doing it. It's what I'm thinking about. It's something I'm doing. It's not who I am that's wrong. It's the thinking I'm doing that's wrong. And the indication that it's wrong gives me a very clear impression that it isn't me, because it's an effect of a cause that's simply thinking wrong. I'm misutilizing my thinking. I haven't transitioned in my thinking to begin to concede this absolute state of being is an absolute state of being for everything and everyone everywhere. And so I function in ways that are less than intuitive, because I'm always relying on experience and thought.
Right. I'm denying my intuition.
Yes.
Because I think
as though it's possible.
I think my thinking must be more powerful than my intuition.
Well, you think it's real, and intuition, to think
Yes.
that, tied to your point about seeking, to think that we have to find it is to think then that we get credit for what was lost. It follows this whole procession of if who I am is what I think I'm the creator of reality. So what do I start looking for from everybody? Credit. I want to get recognized. I want people to acknowledge me. I want them to recognize who I am. Don't you know who I am? We're begging for people to give us credit because we know there's no credit due. You know what self-consciousness is defined as? Undue regard for appearance. Now, you would think if our self has consciousness, that would be a very elevated state. And it would be the highest state of a self. And yet it's undue regard for appearance. Why? Because it's all about projecting an appearance that seems to be who we are because it isn't who we are. So when we make a claim we have to do something, we think that thing doesn't exist, if not for our own demand. And again, we're taking charge. We're making it happen. We're the ones doing it. When in fact, when we really concede this, we realize we have nothing to do with it. Now we are literally free as children to do whatever we want in the most inspired and innovative way and love it because it's fulfilling, because it's actually the nature of our existence. And we can start actually being effective that way in ways we've been effective the whole time, but in defective ways, rather than starting to see that the effective nature of life is productive and gainful and useful, exactly as the steps say. We'll be usefully whole. Why? Because usefulness is wholeness. Productivity is what we're designed to do. People tend to feel better about who they are as a human by being productive and making not just what they need, but more so they have more to give. That seems to be the bountiful. You know, the story of Job was sort of that thing, had everything taken, but he maintained his commitment, his understanding, and he got more as a result. That productivity doesn't mean it can't come and go. It just means that if we're based on principles, we're going to be aligned, like you were talking earlier, when you start to align thinking with reality and realize that if reality is real, you don't have to think at all. Now we don't have to think about our thinking at all for it to function. And now it starts doing things we would have thought are unimaginable because we're no longer preordaining the imagination we thought we needed to have to do the thing we're doing because it's just happening naturally. We're naturally having a knowing that's expressing itself because that is, in fact, our nature. Our intuitive nature, intuition by definition is knowledge beyond reason. If it's beyond reason, it doesn't include thinking and understanding. There's no logic involved.
Right.
There's no rationale involved. It's actually irrational to rationale and illogical to logic and preposterous to reason. So those are all good indicators we're on the right track. At least we're on the track, recognizing the track has always been where we are. And we've simply been thinking we weren't. That's it. It's that simple.
Right.
Ty?
Yes.
So does that ring for you in any way?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean,
It
it's
sounds somewhat hopeful.
yeah. Yeah. I mean, it all just kind of, it flows.
Just part of the issue is that defensiveness and reactiveness is always an immediate conclusion that we're right. So if that's been the preponderance of our history and experience, considering things often feels like, well, I considered it for 30 seconds and now I've concluded that I'm going to dismiss it. Rather than start to actually just live with it and just say, well, if it has any basis, it has a basis. And there's no risk to who I am if it's a basis, because it would be the same basis that I am. And just let it sit and kind of live with it, embrace it, have it.
That's kind of what I've been doing.
I can hear that.
I'm just kind of being mindful. And it's been interesting.
But I'll assure you that the attention, your mindfulness has always been there minus your feeling it was there because of the preoccupation of thinking you have to do something about it to have it. The real freedom is seeing that it's a gift. It's already been given to us in its entirety, and it's our nature. And if it's natural, we don't have to do anything about it. And as we begin reckoning with that in our thinking, the thinking starts to dissolve and the expressions become so fulfilling because we're doing things we know to do without thinking about it at all. And the thought is, I never would have thought of that because we're not looping on the thought of thought. We're starting to actually reckon with this absolute knowing nature that just has us think better naturally because we're designed to think productively and gainfully and usefully and abundantly. Thrive and survive is the instinct of an organism. And to do things that are killing us in the long run is not accomplishing that because we're part of the entire species of humans, not just for the time we're here. We represent the links in that seeming past and that thing we call the future. And what are we doing? We've been leaving it to the children for years, saying, well, the children are our future. And we applaud the children being the future by adults who have basically absconded with the responsibility for the present. Let them figure it out. What kind of future is that? That's horrible. That's like thinking we're better off because other people are worse off. That's just sick. That's a demented idea rather than say, well, maybe if we were all thinking healthy thoughts, we would be witnessing healthy consequences rather than these sort of reactive, defective positions and feelings we have. This kind of closing off and shutting down and trying to escape and carving out a life of our own somewhere else, some panacea. I've never gone anywhere where people didn't exist. I was in Mexico once. Speaking of Mexico, it seems like you cannot go anywhere there that within 2 hours, somebody doesn't walk past you. You'd be 50 miles out on a dirt road. Somebody walks past. It's miraculous.
Same thing out on the Navajo reservation. There's vast straight stretches of highway where you just don't see a building anywhere for miles and miles and miles, 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 miles. You don't see a building. And there's a guy walking along the side of the road. You go, what are you doing out here? And then this has been, I think before I came here to Mexico, or about the time I came here 30 some years ago. I don't remember if it was Corps of Engineers or National Geographic Society or somebody had done this study. I can't remember who did it. And they were using satellites that were available at the time. And they said that their study result said there was no place that you could go in the United States of America, in the continental United States of America, and be more than a mile from a road. More than 1 mile from a road. So wherever we are, if we want to go somewhere, we may have about 1 mile of difficult travel through the forest or the jungle or whatever it is, but we're going to be on a road. So just pick a direction and go. And in a mile, easy, hard, struggle, trudge, whatever it takes you to get there, in a mile, you'll be on a road. And that road will go not only somewhere, it will go everywhere.
Right. Well, and that speaks to the point that we never get away from anyone and anything. It's just a experience we're having that there's distance and we're away, but that aspect of us that's truly who we are, this knowing absolute being nature, is our essence. When we begin to operate on that basis, you realize that everyone is still a part of our existence, even when we don't see them, just like the world was always there when we didn't see it. Those parts of the world we didn't think we could travel to were always there, and there were people doing what people were doing there, and became fascinating. We discovered all the tea in China when we actually started going beyond those limits and thought, wow, there's stuff here we like, we want. The British are huge tea drinkers. It all came from finally realizing that horizon had no end. And then interestingly, as you approach a horizon, it's always moving to the degree you're moving toward it away. So it never is reachable. So the idea that it was doom is absurd. And it's the same with our limited thoughts. We are not doomed by our limited thoughts only to the degree that we really believe they're limited. Do we create that impression to justify what we're doing is real and true because we're witnessing the effect? If we're witnessing the effect of something, we are the cause of that thing that we are witnessing the effect of. It can't happen on its own. These effects don't just happen to us. They're part of what we're thinking about what's happening. So we will be here again. Let me think. Next week is the beginning of June, so we'll be here that Sunday. Beginning of July, sorry.
Good, I should be here.
And look forward to seeing everyone who's interested and able. And seventh step is humility. Humility is the center of honesty and letting things be and starting to see that humility isn't about making things better or worse. It's not about self-deprecation. If the greatness of the infinite source is the infinite source of our essence, then that's a pretty great thing. And if there's anything to be grateful for, it would be the fullness of greatness that we have. And to think of it in any smaller terms with that is not humility. To think of it as greater than that, which you can't, because if it's infinite, it can't be greater. There is no bound to it, so there's nothing that could be greater than that. Wouldn't be humility either. Humility is starting to see things as they are because they are as they are. Not greater, not smaller, not more, not less, not here, not there, or not there and not here. Always present where we are as they are, regardless of what we think of them. And starting to notice that if you can make the distinction between your thinking of things and things, it's a pretty good introduction to a relationship you can have to those things that's at peace, rather than one that you're constantly fighting to defend the thinking you're doing about it, which has nothing to do with the thing and everything to do with what you're thinking. And this stuff may seem complex, but I will assure you that nature is not complex at all, because if it's our nature, when we start abiding by it in the least, it becomes easier and easier and easier to start conceding the things that used to take so much of our time feeling serious, because we start laughing at it and realize that that thing we took seriously as ourself was an imposter the whole time and laughable once we saw it as something that wasn't serious. We didn't continue to take ourselves so seriously that we thought we had to fight everyone and everything in every other way that we tend to be reactive and impulsive and compulsive about. So continue the dishes, Ty. I'll think of you now when I do them. I'll tell Katie to think of you too. So since she's no longer my dishwasher.
I mean, you know, it's just the two of us, so it's pretty easy. And
yeah,
she works all day, and you know, I just enjoy doing it.
Yeah,
I'm the dishwasher as well.
Think of the simplicity of that act, and for every motion, there's something accomplished, something done. It's confirming to our exercise and our practice to the brain to see productive results for its efforts. It is not confirming at all to anything other than insanity to be thinking about things that aren't happening and wondering why they have such a damning impact on our experience. You can't do anything with what's not happening. You can only imagine what can be done that can never be done. The application, just like walking, tends to be a great meditative thing. Bill Wilson used to walk. That was his thing. Nietzsche used to walk. He used to climb a mountain in a suit with a stick, a walking stick. And he was a pretty good thinker. But that connection of doing something, giving your body something to do. So your brain's saying, okay, I'm accomplishing something. I'm doing something. One foot in the front of the other. That works. And now all of a sudden, that greater sense of awareness that isn't in our brain, by the way. Our brain is like a prism where light goes through it and the light divides into the different. Think of the emotions we have as all the colors of the light. And we refer to our emotions connected to those lights. Red and yellow and green and blue, and all those things are connected to emotions. Our brain is sort of like our quartz, our prism. The light is passing through us. Depending on how we think, determines what we're seeing in terms of the colors that we're adjusting to, and the imposition of that lens of the looking glass that we're looking through. I don't know if that came out right, but it's.
All right, I'm gonna bounce.
It's good to see you all. Love you.
Gotta get back to LA. Go easy, everyone. Have a great week. Peace and love.
Jackie, sorry to be done when you're coming in, but we're glad to see your name in lights.
Bye,
Hi.
Jack. Love you guys.
You too.
Bye, Jana. Oh. Bye, you guys.